One comment that I consistently get here on the channel is we want more AWS projects. Do a video where I can build something end-to-end using a variety of AWS services. Well, you got it. I do have one other video like that. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. But here's another. So we've got Wild Rydes, which is basically an Uber or Lyft, except for unicorns. We've got some good static content here, but we're also going to incorporate user registration and login. And by the time we're done, we're going to be able to work with some map functionality here so that if we were in Seattle, let's say, we could request a unicorn just by clicking on the map. We'll request a unicorn. And voila, here comes Angel, the white unicorn, on the way. She's arrived. Giddy up. Now, this is actually an AWS sample project, so I can't take credit for all the brilliance here, but I will walk you through how to build it basically from scratch. I think it's really a great app for tying together a bunch of different services in AWS, and you'll actually have a working application when you're done that you could share with friends or family if you want. All of the code is available for download, so no worries there. Here's a list of all the different services that we're going to be using, quite a few. And these are all pretty common in modern web applications, so hopefully you'll learn a lot here that you can take to other projects. As far as what this will cost, everything we're doing should be in the AWS free tier, which is typically good for the first 12 months that you have an account. If you're outside of that window, it shouldn't cost you any more than about $1, but stick around to the end and I'll walk you through how to delete everything that we set up just so you don't get any surprise bills. As far as what you'll need to follow along, you'll need some kind of a text editor or somewhere to keep notes. We'll need to copy and paste various IDs and credentials and whatnot for use later. You will need an AWS account and access to the console. Some basic knowledge of AWS. I'm assuming that you're familiar with the console and some basics of the different services. And then for the mapping functionality, we're going to be using ArcGIS, and you will need an account there. It's free and easy to set up. Just go out to arcgis.com. I already have an account and I'm signed in, but if you don't have an account, there'll be a sign in link up here. And then once you click on that, you'll have the option to create a new account. So that's very important. Otherwise, your maps are not going to work. All right, so now that we've seen what we're working towards, let's talk through how we're going to get there. Making this as real world as possible, pretend that a customer asked you to build them an application and they're giving you some high level requirements for it. First thing we're going to need is a way to store and update and pull the code. So all of this code is available from AWS, and we need a way to get it into a source control system, basically. And we also need to be able to handle permissions for the code. So really just some setup work here, these first couple of bullets. We need a place to host a website, and we should also be able to make updates there that get deployed automatically, ideally. We need a way for users to register and log into the site. We obviously need some ride-sharing functionality. We'll need somewhere to store and return the ride results. And then we need a way to actually invoke that functionality as well from the browser. We'll work down this list as we go throughout the video, starting with the top two, basically getting our code set up. The service we're going to use for that is AWS CodeCommit, which is AWS's source control system, kind of like GitHub. You could actually use GitHub as well for what we're doing, but everything I'll be showing will be using CodeCommit. And this is where we're going to store HTML files and CSS and JavaScript and so on for the site. Now, before we dive in, just make a note of the region that you're working in. Here in the AWS console, that will be up here on the top right. I'm going to be in US West 2. You can be in some other region, but there are a couple of places where this will come into play, where you'll need to update the name of the region to get things working. So just make a note of that and make sure that you're consistent with the region that you're working in. So here's what we need to do. Our good friends over at AWS have put all of the code, the HTML and CSS and so on, in a publicly accessible S3 bucket. So we're not really going to be writing much from scratch, which is awesome. So we need to take that code and create a CodeCommit repo and basically copy the code into our repository where we can then work with it. There are several steps that we need to take here to do that. So let's just start here. First, we need an empty repository in CodeCommit. So out to the console, let's go to CodeCommit. It's really easy to create a new repository. Just create repository. And then the name will be wildrydes-site. Now, I did already set up a repository with that name, so I'm going to use 2 on the end of mine, and then create. So that basically gives us an empty repository. We'll check that one off the list, easy peasy. Now we need to do a little bit of permissions work in IAM so that we can actually access CodeCommit. Back here in the console, I'll open up a new tab, and then we'll go to IAM, Identity and Access Management, of course. Now, I'm currently logged in as an IAM user that has admin access. As a best practice, you shouldn't really be using your root account for this, and I'm assuming in the rest of this video that you are not using the root account, so we need to go and do some of these IAM updates here and in other places. But I'll go into my list of users, and then click on my ttt-admin here. On the Permissions tab, we want to add permissions, and add permissions. Attach policies directly here on the right. And for this one, we want to search for the AWS CodeCommit power user. So you can just type that in to filter down and then select the one for power user here. Next. And then add permissions. So that should give us the CodeCommit access that we need. Okay, moving on. Next, we're going to need to create some Git credentials for the IAM user to allow HTTPS connections to CodeCommit. So again, CodeCommit is a source control repository that uses the Git technology, and so we have an additional set of credentials there that we need to get all of this working. Back to my IAM user, I want to come into Security Credentials, and then scroll down here to the HTTPS Git credentials for CodeCommit. I've already got some credentials that I generated here, but if you don't have them, it's easy to generate. Just click on the Generate Credentials. You can have 2 sets of these. You'll have a username and then your password, which you can show. I will delete these when I'm done, but you can just copy these, make a note of them, or download them. And again, these will let us make HTTPS calls to CodeCommit. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is clone the repository. Now, the repository at the moment is basically empty, but it's going to create a folder for future use, and it just lets us test out that everything's working as far as credentials go. So here we're going to go back to CodeCommit. If you've closed out of that, just go into your repositories and the one that we just created. And then we want to grab the URL that we would use to clone this. We want to grab the HTTPS version. So just click on that. That doesn't actually clone. The name kind of makes it seem like it's cloning. It's really just copying the URL that you would use to clone it. And then what we're going to do is open up CloudShell right here on the top of the browser. If you aren't familiar with CloudShell, it's basically a command line interface or CLI that runs in the browser. There is an AWS CLI that you can download and install locally on your machine, but you will need to configure it. It needs a secret access key and access key IDs, and I find it's just a little bit clunky, and a lot of people have issues with it, and it can be hard to troubleshoot when things go wrong. So that's why we're here in the browser. When you use CloudShell, the credentials and so on are all handled behind the scenes for you, and so life is just a lot simpler. So what we want to do here, let me increase my zoom a little bit, is git clone. And then we want this URL that we copied here a second ago. And then we'll need to enter our username. That's this username back here that you just generated. So I'll grab mine, paste it in, and then your password. Hopefully you made a note of this when that dialog was open because you can't get back to your password. So if you didn't make a note, you'll need to generate some new credentials. But I've got mine on a clipboard, so let me go grab mine and paste it in. Now, when you paste, it's not going to look like anything happened. So be careful not to paste it 2 or 3 times. Just paste it once and then hit enter. And then we're going to get a warning that it appears that we've cloned an empty repository. And that is true, and that's totally fine. What's happened, though, is here in CloudShell, you have what's called a home directory, which is where files and documents and so on live that you can access later. So if we do an ls to list what's here, we now have a folder called wildrydes-site 2. If we were to change directories cd into that, and then ls, you'll see it's just an empty folder. So basically, cloning the repository just created an empty folder for us, and this is where the code files will eventually end up before they go to our repository. So the last thing we need to do is grab the code from the S3 bucket, copy it to the empty folder that we have in CloudShell, and then commit it to our repo. So this part right here on the lower right. So back here in CloudShell, if you haven't already navigated inside of this folder, Wild Rides, then do that now, cd wildrydes-site. And then I'll grab the command to copy things out of the S3 bucket. I'll also put this command in the description of the video if you just want to copy and paste it. But basically we're saying AWS, this is an AWS command, S3 is our service, CP is copy, and then S3 : / Wild Rides US West 2. So this is the S3 bucket that AWS has set up for us where the code lives. This is not anything that you set up. So make sure that you're using this name, but you will need to change the region right here. If you're using a different region, make sure you update this. So I'm in US West 2 in Oregon, but if you're in another region, say you're in US East 1 or US East 2 or something like that, you want to update that name. And then /web application /1_ static website hosting /website space / and then -- recursive. All right, so this is going to go out, grab the code from the S3 bucket. Here we go, downloading. Excellent. So right now the files are just sitting in this CloudShell home directory. If we were to do another ls, we'll see the files here. We've got some folders as well. They are not in the CodeCommit repository yet. So to do that, we need to do git add space period. So the period says we want to add everything, all the stuff that we just copied from S3. We want to add this to CodeCommit. And then you'll do git commit -m. And this is the message about what this commit is, what action you're taking. So I'll just say initial commit, so that in the future we can look back at this commit and know what we did. It says, please tell me who you are, and we'll need to run these commands right here for a username and email. There is a credential helper if you're working locally that will make this a little bit easier for you, but I'm only going to do it once here on the command line, so I'll just enter my stuff manually, entering these commands. So there's my email, and then the other one for my username. This is just the IAM user that I'm logged in as. This is not the username back here. So just your IAM user, which for me is ttt-admin, you'll see up there on the top right. Okay, and then finally, git push. This is what will actually push things out to our CodeCommit repository. Actually, my bad, I need to go back and do my commit again. There we go. And now we can do the push. So git add, git commit, enter your credentials, do git commit again, and then git push. And then for this one, it's this username right here. And then our password. Paste that in, hit enter, and there we go. Okay, so things are finally pushing out to our repository. Hopefully you were able to follow along, a little bit of back and forth there. But let's go look at our files now. So I'll zoom out a little bit. Back here in my repository, close out of this, come back to repositories, and site 2 is the one that I was working in. And then over here on the left, code. And here's all of our code. So this code came from the S3 bucket that Amazon provided. We copied it into our local CloudShell home directory and then pushed it. Here's the repository where we can work with it. So pretty simple code, some CSS, some images, some JavaScript and HTML files. Feel free to come take a look around in here, but we're going to move on to the next step in our project. Okay, now that that setup work is out of the way, we've got the code. Now we need a place to host it so a user could actually browse to this location. And we also need to be able to make updates to the code and have those updates pushed out to wherever we're hosting it. The service we're going to use for this is Amplify. It's super easy. You can build and host websites with Amplify. And it's a really good service, particularly for front-end developers. But let's go set this one up now. We aren't going to need CloudShell anymore, so I'll just close out of that. And then I'll open up a new tab here in the console. And we'll go to Amplify. Amplify also, lucky for us, will let us hook up to a CodeCommit repository and pull our code from there. So yet another reason to go with this. But over here on the right, we'll do New App and Host Web App. We'll choose CodeCommit, but Amplify does work with these other providers as well. Hit Continue. And then we'll select the repository that we created earlier. Mine was Site 2. Yours might just be Site. And then the branch should be selected automatically for you if there's just the one. And then we'll say Next. For the app name, I will leave this as it is, Site 2 for me, since I already have another one. And then make sure you select this here, allow Amplify to automatically deploy files, which basically means as soon as you make an update in a code file, it will automatically deploy. So continuous deployment essentially is what this is. And then scrolling down, we'll create a new service role and then say Next, review, and then save and deploy. And then you can watch the progress here of what's happening. So with provisioning infrastructure and different things that it needs to run, this is considered serverless, meaning we didn't have to go set up an EC2 instance and all of that for hosting the website. So that's what it's doing now. And then it's going to build the stage it's in now, and then it will push our code out to the infrastructure that it's set up in the provision stage. So I'll give this a minute to run and be back when it's done. Okay, we've got green check marks and everything, so that looks good. Let's test it out. We should be able to open up the site with this link right here in a new tab. And like magic, here is our site. Awesome. Now let's check that we can update our code, commit a change, and then have it reflected here by having Amplify deploy it. So basically testing that continuous deployment is working. So let's come back to CodeCommit here to our repository, and I'll open up index.html. I can just click on the file here in the browser, and then over to Edit. There's some text on the site right here that says, how does this work? So let's just update that to say, how does this thing work? Just so we can see the change. A small change, but then scrolling down, I can commit my changes. I'll put my name in, my email address. Commit messages are usually a good idea, especially if you're working with a team, but I'm going to skip it for now and we'll commit changes. And by committing that change, that should have triggered Amplify back here. Looks like it did. So we're going through the steps again to basically push out the change. So we'll go through provision, build, and deploy. And when that's done, we should be able to see our text change on the UI. I'll give it a minute and be back when this is done. And success. So now if we go back to our site and refresh, how does this thing work? So our change is there, Amplify is working, we're pulling code, we're able to commit code and continuously deploy. Excellent work. But at the moment, it really doesn't do anything. I can't log in, I can't register, I definitely can't use maps at the moment. So let's talk about what's next. Let's work on that user registration and login part. And for this, we're going to be using Cognito. This is used to do authentication. With this service, you can do authentication by having people register with their own accounts, or you can use external identity systems like Facebook or Twitter or Amazon or other SAML or OpenID providers. It's actually very powerful and also pretty easy to set up, so let's go work on that next. Now, when you're working in Amplify, if you come into the back-end environments here, you can actually use Amplify Studio to set up Cognito and other parts of the application all from right here. This is actually one of the selling points of Amplify, that you can add different components as you build out the application. For our purposes, though, I think it's actually a bit more instructive to head over to Cognito to do that work, and then we'll come back to our application and make some configuration changes to hook things up. But let me open up a new tab, and we'll just go directly to Cognito. And the main construct in Cognito is a user pool. So we'll want to create a new user pool. Cognito user pool is selected for us by default. That's what we want. And then we can choose the attributes that we want for people to sign in. I'm just going to do username, but you could do email or phone number as well. We won't do any username requirements. We'll just skip through that and say next. We'll go with Cognito defaults on a password policy, but you can do a custom policy as well if you want to do that. For multi-factor authentication, usually a good idea, but just keeping things simple, we're going to say no MFA. We'll do the defaults here and say next. We'll enable self-registration, so we'll be able to go into Wild Rides and register. We'll leave all the defaults on the rest of this page and then next. So you can get really granular with this if you want to, but you can also keep it pretty simple like we're doing. Cognito will send an email to verify users when they sign up. You can either do that using SES, simple email service, or I'm just going to go with sending email with Cognito. This is good for development, up to 50 emails a day. That's plenty for what we're doing. So I'll select that, leave all the defaults here for the from and reply to email addresses, and then say next. The user pool name, I'll go with Wild Rides 2 in my case, but you can go with Wild Rides. Scrolling down, for initial app client, we need a client name, and this will be the Wild Rides web app. We can leave defaults everywhere else here, and then next. Review, and then all the way to the bottom, we will create this user pool. Now we want to click into the user pool, and we need to copy a couple of things. So bring up your notepad or whatever you're using to take notes. I am using a notepad here, and we want to copy the user pool ID, so just grab that. I'll make a note of what it is. And then under App Integration, down here on the tab, we also need to copy the client ID right here under App Clients and Analytics. So just copy that to Notepad as well. And now what we need to do is update the config file in our application code to basically point to this user pool. This is how we hook up Cognito with our code and with Amplify. So back over to CodeCommit, to our repo. In code, we want to go into the JS folder here, JavaScript. And there's a file in here called config.js. We'll edit this. And then the user pool ID and the client ID that we just copied into Notepad, we want to put those in here. So user pool ID, copy it right here between the quotes. And then the user pool client ID on the next line. And then we also need to update the region. So once again, I am in US West 2. We'll come back and update the Invoke URL a little bit later, but for now, let's commit these changes. As you know by now, that will kick off Amplify back here under Hosting Environments to provision, build, and deploy. So I'll give it a second and be back when it's done. Okay, so back to our site. I'll just do a refresh here for good measure, and then we should be able to test out the registration and login functionality with the Giddy Up button right here. So I'll click on this, and ta-da! Let's register. So I'll put in my email address and a password, and let's ride. So the Cognito email service should have just sent us an email. Let me go grab that. And all of that worked. Just to show you what the email looks like, it's super simple, but we've got the confirmation code here, so I'll grab this. Then go back to the browser, put in my email address here, and then the verification code. Verification was successful. We'll be redirected to the login. Perfect. So now we can log in with that email address and the password and sign in. So all of that functionality of registering and getting the verification email and code and all of that all happened by us setting up the Cognito user pool, which is actually pretty simple and straightforward. So a very powerful service with Cognito. Now this has taken us to the ride.html page, which will eventually have the map on it. We haven't set any of that up yet, but there is this authentication token right here that you want to grab, and then copy this to your notepad or wherever you're keeping notes. And we'll use this later. All right, what do we need to do next? Well, next you need to hit that like button if you haven't already. If you're enjoying the video, I would super appreciate it. It really does help the content spread to more people. And also think about subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Thank you so much. Okay, but seriously, next we need to work on the ride sharing functionality. We're making a ton of progress here. But with this functionality, a user will request a ride, and then we need to send a unicorn to their location. These two pieces work together, so we're going to tackle both of them in this next section. First, we're going to use a Lambda function. As you might know, a Lambda function is a bit of code that runs in response to some trigger. In our case, the function will be triggered every time a user requests a unicorn. Link above and below for a video about Lambda if you need the basics there. And then the second part of this is a DynamoDB database. This is a key value or NoSQL database, generally a lighter weight option than something like a relational database where you have to go set up your schema and your relationships and everything ahead of time. Also, link above and below if you want details on DynamoDB. But the user is going to request a ride that will invoke the Lambda function. The function will select a unicorn from the fleet and then record that request in the DynamoDB table, and then respond to the front end with details about the unicorn that's being dispatched. Okay, so we actually need to go set up the DynamoDB table first. Back out to the console. Let me just open up a new tab here, and we'll go to DynamoDB. Under Tables, we'll create a new table. You'll want to name your table Rides. I'm going to go with Rides 2, just because I already have a Rides. Per partition key, this should be Ride ID with R, lowercase I, D, E, and then uppercase I, D. And this will be a string. We can go with defaults everywhere else, and then create table. Once your table is active here and successfully created, click into it. And then here under General Information, you want to expand Additional Info. And we want to copy the Amazon Resource Name, or ARN. So I'll just grab this and then put that in Notepad. And then next we need to work on our Lambda function. But you'll see that when we go to create the Lambda function, it's going to ask us for the execution role. The execution role basically says what the function has permissions to do. And specifically, Lambda is going to need permissions to write to this DynamoDB table that we just created. So we're actually going to create a role first. Roles happen under IAM. So I'll go back to where we were before, IAM and then roles. We'll create a new role. The trusted entity type is AWS service, and the service will be Lambda, pretty common one. And then we can say next. And then we need to search for policies to attach to the role, basically the permissions that this role should have. Let's filter by AWS Lambda, basic execution role should show up here. Select that. And then next. The name for the role, you want to use Wild Rides Lambda. You can leave the defaults for everything else and then say create role. All right, now let's go open up that role. So I'll filter by wild, open the role, and we need to add some additional permissions. So over here, add permissions and create inline policy. Here we basically need to give it the ability to write to a DynamoDB table. So the service is going to be DynamoDB. Select that. And it's a best practice to only give permissions to things that it absolutely needs. So using the least amount of permissions possible. We could just give it permission to do everything, but it's a better idea to filter down. So the one we want is called PutItem, which will let Lambda write an item to our DynamoDB table. So if you just type in PutItem, this is a write type of function. Select that. And then the resource, basically where you want it to be able to write, here we also want to be specific and limited. Instead of giving it the ability to write to everywhere, we'll say specific, and then we'll add the ARN to that table that we just created. So click on the Add ARNs link, switch over to the Text tab, and then we'll paste in the ARN of the table. Let me grab that. It was this one right here. And then add ARNs. Then we can say next. The policy name will be DynamoDB write access, and then create policy. Okay, so now that we have the DynamoDB table set up, we have a role that will allow us to write to it. Now let's work on the Lambda function that does most of the magic in this application. So we're getting there. I will open up a new tab for Lambda. And now let's create a new Lambda function. We'll author from scratch. The name will be request unicorn. I'm going to do 2 on mine again since I have another one. The runtime, very important on this one. Don't let it default you to the latest version of Node. Instead, we specifically need Node 16x. It won't work with newer versions, so heads up there. And then down here for the execution role, all of that work that we just did with our role in IAM, that's where this comes into play. So we want to use an existing role, and then the existing role, we should be able to filter Wild Rides Lambda, and then we can create the function. Okay, so we've got the function and just some boilerplate code here. The code that you want, I've actually uploaded to my Google Drive, and I'll include a link to this in the description of the video. But it's right here. This does come from AWS. Like I said in the beginning, I cannot take credit for this, but you want to grab this code here, Lambda function, a fair amount of code. Don't get everything at the bottom. At the bottom, we've got the test event. So just go to the end of this page right here, copy that, and then back here, basically replace everything with that code. And then we'll just briefly walk through what's happening here. So up here on top, we've got our fleet of unicorns. So Angel, Gil, and Rocinante, I believe is how you say it. So you could change the names or add additional unicorns here if you wanted to. And then we've got our handler. You'll have one of these in every Lambda function, taking in the event, the context, and the callback. So basically the information we're going to get from the user in the browser, and then we can do stuff with it. The ride ID will just be random bytes from the URL. We're going to get the username from the request context, the Cognito username. The pickup location will come from the request body as well. That's where the user clicked on the map. And then we're saying record ride, where we're grabbing all of the information that we have. Then we actually call that function definition right down here, record ride. And this is where we write things to our DynamoDB table. So really important, if you used a name different than rides for your DynamoDB table, make sure you update that name here. Mine is actually rides2, so I'll update that. There's a function right here, kind of a placeholder, if you wanted to implement some additional logic to find the optimal unicorn for the ride. So there's definitely different things that you could do in here. We've got some helper functions, some error handling, and so on. Okay, now really importantly, always check this message right here, changes not deployed. So we just updated our code, but it hasn't been pushed out anywhere that Lambda could grab it and run it. So very important, you want to make sure to deploy the code anytime you make a change to it. Perfect. And now we want to test it out to make sure that things are working here before we go try it as an end user. So click on the arrow here to the right of test and configure a test event. For a name, I'll say test request event. And then down here, you basically pass in JSON code similar to what you would be getting from the browser from the user. So I do have some test code here that we can use back here in this document, right here at the bottom of the document. So I'll just grab this. And again, the link to this document is in the description for the video. So don't feel like you have to type everything out from scratch. I'll replace everything here with that code. And then save. And then now we need to run the test. So we're saying for this test data we're sending in, let's make sure that our function is working. If everything did work, you should get a status code of 201, and you'll see things like the name of our unicorn, Gil, white, gender, and so on. So it looks like everything is working, which is awesome. Let's also check out our DynamoDB table to see if things were written here. So in the table, you can click on Explore Table Items. And then scrolling down, we should have the one item here. Here we go. We've got the unicorn. We can open this up. The request time, when it came in, we've got the ride ID, which again is just random. The unicorn, color, gender, and name. Now just a heads up, in another video where we do some DynamoDB work, some people have told me there's a delay with things getting written to the DynamoDB table. Mine have always been very immediate, but for whatever reason, some people have a delay. So if yours doesn't show up right away, maybe just give it a minute or two, refresh, and then hopefully everything will be there. All right, excellent work, everybody. We are on the last question mark here. Now we need a way to invoke all of this brilliant work that we've done. So this piece right here in yellow, we saw how to invoke and test the Lambda function through the console, and that seems to be working. But obviously, we are not expecting our end users to do that. They're just going to be out in their browser. They're going to click on a map, and then some kind of magic should happen. So what does this piece right here look like? Well, for this, we're actually going to use API Gateway. This is really a core service in AWS, especially for decoupled applications, microservices, that type of thing, where you can build your own APIs, whether those are HTTP or REST or WebSockets and so on. It's really the perfect way to invoke a Lambda function. So let's go do that now. Back here at the console, I'll open up yet one more tab. Hopefully this is it for the tabs. And then we'll go to API Gateway. As of the time of this recording, AWS recently updated their UI for API Gateway. I am going to use the new UI. If you're still on the old version, hopefully you have an option to go to the new UI, but just a heads up in case yours looks different than mine. Try to get to the new UI if you can, because the old one is probably going away. But let's create a new API. This one is going to be a REST API. So scrolling down, we'll say build, new API. The name will be Wild Rides, and 2 for me. The API endpoint type, we're going to go with edge optimized. This is typically what you want for things that are being served over the internet. A regional endpoint would typically be used for things that are just accessed within the same AWS region. And then private, obviously, is for private. But we're going to go for edge optimized and then create. I'll just close out of some of these messages here to tidy things up. Now, because we're using Cognito user pools, we do need to create an authorizer over here on the left nav. To authenticate calls, API Gateway uses JWTs, or JSON Web Tokens, that are returned by Cognito. So here we're basically hooking up the two parts by creating this authorizer. So we'll create authorizer. Name is Wild Rides. Type is going to be Cognito. My region right here, US West 2, I should be able to find my user pool. So mine had the 2 at the end. I'll select that. For token source, this is the header that's going to be sent in, and ours will be authorization. And then create authorizer. Now let's click into this authorizer, and we'll test that things are working. So you might remember way back when we had an authorization token that we copied into Notepad. If you didn't copy this for some reason, you should be able to get to it from Wild Rides and then ride.html. It was this thing right here. So let's take that back to API Gateway and test it out. Enter that token right here. Make sure you don't have any spaces or new lines at the end of it. That will cause it to fail. And then say test authorizer. And you should get a status code of 200. Everything looks great. Awesome. Okay, let's back up to our API here. Now that we've got that authorizer in place, I was in Wild Rides 2. And now we need to create a resource. This is basically how we're going to hook up to the Lambda function. So resource name will be ride. You can leave the path as it is. And then we do need to enable CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. The reason for this is basically because our domain on the site, which we're getting from Amplify, remember the domain right here, is going to be different from the domain or the URL that we use to invoke this API gateway call. So traffic is going cross-domain or cross-origin. If you don't select this, then nothing's going to work. So make sure to select that checkbox and then create resource. And then with ride selected right here, come over and create method. The method type will be post. We're going to integrate with the Lambda function that we created. You want to toggle on the Lambda proxy integration. And then down here, select your Lambda function. So for me, this was request unicorn 2. Yours is probably just request unicorn. And then create method. Okay, let me clean up some of these messages here. Now down here, select your method request card or the method request tab right here. And then scrolling down, we want to edit. And the way we're going to authorize this particular method request is with the Cognito user pool, Wild Rides. Okay, scrolling down, let's save. And then finally, let's deploy this API. So the orange button right here. For stage, I'll create a new stage, and I'll just call this dev for development and deploy. Okay, perfect. Now I'll grab this Invoke URL right here, and I also need to paste this into Notepad. So Invoke URL, and we're almost done. We just need to make a couple more code updates, and then we can go test this out. So back to CodeCommit, to our code. We want to be in the JS folder, config.js. I still have this one open from last time. We basically need to update the Invoke URL here with the one that we just copied. So let's edit. I'll paste that in. So that's the Invoke URL for the API gateway call. I'll commit this change. And then there's one other update we need to go make around the mapping scripts. So back to code, This one's going to be in ride.html. So I'll open that up and then edit this file. There are two things that you need to update here for the ArcGIS versions. Rather than 4.3, this should be 4.6. And then there's another one down here at the bottom. So rather than 4.3, make sure that's 4.6. I will commit this change as well. And now all I need to do is just wait for Amplify to work its magic, push out those changes that we just committed. I will pause and then be back, and we'll test out our final application. Very excited. Okay, everything has been deployed. Let's go check it out. So back to Wild Rides. I'll refresh the ride.html page. And ta-da, there's our map. If you don't see a map, or if you're getting a prompt for logging in, just make sure that you're logged in already in your browser at arcgis.com with that account that you set up that we talked about in the beginning. That's one common troubleshooting tip there. But here's our map. Let's zoom in here. Let's say that we're in Seattle. We want to ride from a unicorn. So let's just click somewhere on the map. And then we'll say request unicorn. And here we go. Unicorn is flying across the map. We've got Gil, a white unicorn, on the way. Gil has arrived, and giddy up. Yay, it worked. Let's also check our DynamoDB table to see if we've got this additional item in here. Cancel out of this one. Down here for my items, I'll refresh. And there's the second item. So everything is working end to end, just as it should. Awesome. So I hope you were able to follow along and have a working application yourself. There's a lot more you could do with this. Hooking up that ride page to some navigation or something like that. There's some fun static things in here as well that you could hook up. But hopefully that helped you understand all the different parts and services available in AWS to create an application like this. Now, before you run off, one very, very important reminder. If you've been following along, let's go delete everything that we spun up in this video. Again, it should be all in the free tier, but just in case, or if you're outside of that window, you don't want any big bills at the end of the month. So let's start by deleting our Amplify app. Back to Amplify. And I'll expand the left nav here, all apps. I'll select mine. And then up here under Actions, delete app. We'll confirm. And delete. Now let's go to our Cognito user pool. So user pools. This was Wild Rides 2 for me. And delete. We also have to say deactivate deletion protection. We'll confirm this and delete. Now let's go get rid of our Lambda function. So back to Lambda. I'll come into functions. This one for me was request unicorn 2. Actions and delete. Delete. And close. In IAM, it won't cost you anything to have this role here. I'm actually going to leave mine because my original app is using it as well. But if you want to delete this role for Wild Rides Lambda, then just say delete here. Now to our DynamoDB table. I'll come into tables here. Rides 2 was mine, and we'll delete. We will delete all CloudWatch alarms. I don't want an on-demand backup. So I'll confirm. Okay, now to API Gateway. Make sure you're getting all of these. Come into APIs. And Wild Rides 2 for me. Delete. Now our CodeCommit repository. I'll come into repositories. And I will delete this one here. Delete repository. And delete. And then one final thing you might not even know got created, but you'll have a CloudWatch log group as well. This was created automatically to log things from Lambda. So if we come into log groups and then filter down by request unicorn. I've got request unicorn 2. And then actions and delete log group. And that should be it for all of your resources. And with that, one final thing to do, if you haven't already, hit that like button for me, and also think about subscribing for more content like this. I hope you found it helpful, and thank you so much for watching.